There are lives the world never notices, and there are lives the world cannot stop looking at. But between those two extremes exists something far more difficult to understand. A life that is seen, but not understood. Observed, but not heard. Discussed, but never truly known. That is where this story begins. Not with attention, not with cameras, not with headlines, but with a condition that existed long before any of those things arrived. A condition of distance. Not just physical distance from cities or institutions, but distance from language, distance from recognition, distance from the basic ability to explain oneself to the world. In the hills of Odd, West Virginia, a woman lived inside that distance. Her name was Lorene Whittaker, and for most of her life, the world did not know she existed. That absence of attention is often mistaken for peace. But it is not peace. It is isolation. And isolation, when combined with vulnerability, does not create stillness. It creates confinement. Not the kind of confinement with walls and locks, but the quieter kind. The kind built from limitations that cannot easily be seen. Limitations of speech. Limitations of mobility. Limitations of access. Limitations that shape a life long before that life can question them. Now consider where that life began. Not in a system designed to support it, but in a place already marked by constraint. A rural environment where resources were limited, where distance reduced access to care, where intervention was rare unless something forced it. And inside that environment, a family whose history carried its own weight. Multiple accounts and public discussions have described the Whittaker family as shaped by generations of close intermarriage and the complex effects that can follow from it. That context matters, not because it explains everything, but because it defines the starting point. Lorene was not born into stability that later collapsed. She was born into conditions that were already fragile, already narrow, already constrained. And within that structure, she became one of many children, one of 15, in a household where disability was not an exception. It was part of daily life. That changes the way a person develops. Because when a condition is common within a family, it does not stand out in the same way. It becomes normalized, not because it is easy, but because it is constant, and constancy shapes expectation. Now focus on the detail that defines everything that follows. Communication. Lorene was described as having extremely limited speech, not entirely without understanding, not entirely disconnected from what was happening around her, but unable to consistently translate that understanding into clear, recognized language. That distinction is critical because it separates two very different realities. Being unaware and being unable to express awareness. Those are not the same. One is absence. The other is restriction. And restriction creates a specific kind of experience. An internal world that cannot fully exit the body it exists in. Now imagine the implications of that. Voices around you. Instructions. Questions. Arguments. Laughter. People speaking about you. People deciding things for you. People reacting to you. And inside, some level of recognition. Not necessarily complete. Not necessarily structured in the way others expect. But present. And yet, when you attempt to respond, what emerges is not recognized as language. It is reduced, interpreted, dismissed. Not because others intend harm, but because they do not understand what they are hearing. That is not silence. That is containment. And containment, over time, becomes a form of captivity, not imposed by a single person, but built into the structure of a life. Now consider the environment in which that life unfolded. The Whittaker home has been described in various reports and accounts as severely neglected. A structure marked by decay, clutter, unsanitary conditions, insects, rotting materials, an environment that, when viewed from the outside, creates shock, but from the inside, becomes normal. Because when a person cannot easily leave a place, that place becomes their entire reference point. Not an exception, not a temporary condition, but the baseline. Now ask a difficult question. What does neglect feel like when it is not temporary? When it is not recognized as a deviation from something better? When it is simply the condition in which a life unfolds? It does not feel like a crisis. It feels like reality. And that is where perception begins to split. Outsiders see disorder. Insiders experience continuity. Now combine that environment with limited communication, and something else emerges. Dependence. Not partial dependence, but near total dependence. On others to interpret needs. On others to make decisions. On others to define what is happening. And that dependence creates another layer of confinement. Because when a person cannot clearly express preference, others begin to define it for them. Not always incorrectly, but not always accurately either. And over time, the distinction between what is chosen and what is assigned becomes unclear. Now consider how this shapes identity. If a person cannot consistently assert themselves through recognized language, how are they understood? Through behavior, through reaction, through sound, and those forms are often misinterpreted. A sound of distress becomes noise. A signal of discomfort becomes behavior. An attempt at communication becomes something else entirely. And that misinterpretation accumulates. Now extend this across years, across decades, a lifetime in which internal experience exists, but external recognition remains limited. That is the first layer of this story. Not the cameras, not the attention, but the long period before any of that arrived. A life formed inside constraints that were never fully addressed. Now consider what that means. Because when attention finally arrives, it does not enter neutral space. It enters a structure that has already been shaped by years of limitation, years of adaptation, years of coping, and that structure does not change instantly. It cannot, because it was not built quickly. Now hold on to this, because everything that comes later, every reaction, every interpretation, every public discussion, sits on top of this foundation. A life that existed long before it was seen. A life that was already complex before it was labeled. A life that cannot be understood by looking only at the moment it became visible. Now consider one final thought before moving forward. If a person lives an entire life with limited ability to express themselves, who tells their story? And how accurate can that story be? Comment one word. Inner, if you believe her inner life matters more than what was seen. Seen if you think observation tells us enough. Or unknown, if you believe the truth may never be fully accessible. Because what comes next depends on how we choose to interpret silence. Silence is often misunderstood. People treat it as absence, as emptiness, as a lack of thought, feeling, or awareness. But in many cases, silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something without a way out. And that distinction changes everything. Because when a person cannot consistently translate their internal experience into recognized language, the world does not stop moving. It continues. It speaks. It decides. It interprets. And the person inside that silence must navigate all of it without the tools most people take for granted. Now consider what that means on a daily level. Not in dramatic moments, but in ordinary ones. A question is asked. You understand some part of it. Maybe not every word. Maybe not every detail. But enough to know that a response is expected. And when you try to respond, what comes out is not recognized as an answer. So the moment passes. Not because there was nothing to say, but because what was said was not understood. Now repeat that. Not once. Not occasionally. But across years. Across interactions. Across an entire life. that creates a pattern where attempts at communication are filtered through other people, where meaning is translated, simplified, or dismissed, and where the person at the center of that process becomes increasingly dependent on interpretation. Now consider the emotional impact of that, because communication is not just about exchanging information. It is about control, about being able to say yes, being able to say no, being able to express discomfort, preference, resistance. Without that ability, control shifts. Not completely, but significantly. Now think about how that applies in a household where multiple individuals require care, where resources are limited, where attention is divided, and where survival itself may take priority over structured communication. In that environment, efficiency often replaces precision. Needs are assumed rather than clarified. Decisions are made quickly rather than collaboratively. And over time, that becomes the operating system. Now bring Lorene back into that system. A person who, by most accounts, relied heavily on others to interpret her signals, her reactions, her needs, her boundaries. That reliance is not inherently harmful. In many cases, it is necessary, but it becomes complicated when interpretation is the only pathway available. Because interpretation is not neutral. It is shaped by the interpreter, by their understanding, their patience, their assumptions, and those factors are not constant. They change. Now consider how easily misunderstanding can occur. A sound is made. Is it discomfort? Is it frustration? Is it confusion? Without a clear system of communication, the answer depends on who is listening. And that variability creates instability. Now extend that across different situations. Eating, sleeping, personal space, physical discomfort. Each of these requires communication. And when communication is limited, each becomes an area where misunderstanding can occur. Now consider the environment again, because environment amplifies or reduces difficulty. A structured, supported environment can compensate for communication limitations. It can introduce systems, routines, support mechanisms, but an environment marked by disorder does the opposite. It increases unpredictability, it reduces consistency, and it places additional pressure on individuals who already face limitations. Now think about what it means to live in a space that cannot be easily controlled, where cleanliness is inconsistent, where organization is limited, where change happens without clear explanation. For someone with limited communication, that environment does not just exist around them. It acts on them. It shapes their experience moment by moment. Now consider how that might feel, not in abstract terms, but physically. Smells that cannot be avoided, surfaces that cannot be changed, noise that cannot be filtered, and no reliable way to explain why something is wrong or what needs to change. That is not just discomfort. It is accumulation. Small, repeated experiences that build over time. Now consider the role of routine. Routine provides predictability. Predictability reduces stress. But in an environment where stability is limited, routine becomes fragile. It can break. And when it breaks, there may be no way to explain why that matters. Now return to the idea of internal experience. Because one of the most important points in this entire story is what we do not know. We do not have direct statements from Lorene. No interviews. No recorded explanations of her thoughts. Her memories. Her desires. That absence is not a gap to be filled with imagination. It is a boundary, and respecting that boundary is essential. Because assigning emotions without evidence is not understanding. It is projection. But even without direct testimony, structure reveals something. Dependence, limited communication, restricted environment. These are not neutral conditions. They shape experience. Now consider the role of caregiving. Within the household, Betty is often described as a central figure in communication, acting as a bridge between nonverbal family members and the outside world. That role is significant because it concentrates interpretation in one place. And concentration creates both support and limitation. Support, because there is consistency. Limitation, because it narrows the range of perspectives. Now ask a careful question. What happens when one person becomes the primary interpreter of another's needs? It creates reliance. And reliance, over time, becomes structure. Now consider how outsiders perceive this. They see communication happening. They see interaction, but they may not see the layers within it. The translation, the filtering, the simplification, and that is where misunderstanding deepens. Now extend this beyond the household, because access to external support systems appears to have been limited. Speech therapy, specialized care, structured intervention. There is little evidence that these were consistently present, and that absence matters, because without those systems, the conditions remain unchanged. Not because change is impossible, but because the tools for change are not available. Now consider what that means over time. A child grows into an adult, but the communication system does not evolve at the same pace. And that creates a gap between internal development and external expression. Now think about how that gap affects identity. Because identity is partly formed through interaction, through feedback, through the ability to express and be understood. When that loop is incomplete, identity becomes harder to externalize. It remains internal, partially hidden. Now consider one more layer. Perception from outsiders. When people encounter limited speech, they often make assumptions about awareness, about intelligence, about understanding. And those assumptions are not always accurate. Now connect this to Lorene's situation. Accounts suggest that she understood more than she could express. If that is true, then the gap between perception and reality becomes significant. Because people may respond to what they think is present, not what actually is. Now consider the emotional weight of that. Being treated as less aware than you are. Being responded to based on assumption rather than understanding. And having no reliable way to correct it. That is not just limitation. It is misrepresentation. Now step back. Because everything described so far existed before any public attention, before any cameras, before any outside involvement. This was the baseline. The structure of a life formed in isolation, shaped by limitation, and maintained without significant external intervention. Now hold that in place. Because what happens next, the moment when that life becomes visible, does not replace this structure. It interacts with it. And that interaction changes everything. But not always in the ways people expect. Before moving forward, consider this carefully. If a person understands more than they can express, who decides what they mean? Comment one word. Others if you think interpretation becomes unavoidable. Self, if you believe internal experience still defines the truth. Or conflict if you think the two can never fully align. Because the answer to that question shapes how this entire story is understood. For most of her life, Lorene Whittaker existed outside the frame. Not completely invisible, but unrecorded, untranslated, uninterpreted by the wider world. And then, suddenly, that changed. Not gradually, not quietly, but all at once. Through the arrival of cameras, attention, and an audience that had never seen her before. The turning point came with the work of Mark Leiter, whose interviews and visual documentation brought the Whittaker family into global view through the project's soft white underbelly. What had been local became international. What had been private became public. And what had been unspoken became interpreted, rapidly, widely, and often without restraint. Now consider what that moment represents. Not just exposure, but translation. Because when a life that has never been publicly explained suddenly becomes visible, people do not simply observe it. They try to understand it. And when understanding is incomplete, they fill the gaps. Now return to Lorene, a person with limited speech, a person whose internal world was already difficult to access, now placed at the center of global attention. That creates a paradox. Visibility increases, but direct expression does not. So while more people are looking, no more people are actually hearing her. That imbalance is critical because it means the story expands outward without expanding inward. More opinions, more reactions, more narratives, but no direct increase in her own voice. Now consider what fills that space. Interpretation. People begin to describe what they think they see. They assign meaning to behavior. They create explanations for sounds. They build stories around fragments. And some of those interpretations may be well-intentioned. Others may not. But all of them share one limitation. They are external. Now think about how quickly those interpretations spread. Millions of views, thousands of comments, discussions across platforms, each person bringing their own assumptions, their own frameworks, their own expectations. And because there is no direct correction from the person at the center, those interpretations begin to solidify. Now the story is no longer just being observed. It is being constructed, layer by layer, voice by voice. Now consider the emotional reaction from the audience. For some, the response was compassion, a desire to help, to send money, to improve conditions. For others, the response was fascination, curiosity about something unfamiliar, something different, something that did not fit into their everyday experience. And for some, the line between those two responses became blurred, because curiosity can look like concern, and concern can sometimes become performance. Now consider how that affects the subject, because being seen is not the same as being understood, and being helped is not the same as being represented accurately. Now extend this further. With attention comes value. Not human value, but narrative value. The story becomes something people follow, something people discuss, something people engage with. And that engagement creates momentum. Now ask another difficult question. What happens when a person's life becomes content? Not in a controlled, self-directed way, but through external documentation, through the lens of others, through the interpretation of an audience. The answer is complicated, because content has its own dynamics. It needs continuation. It needs development. It needs engagement. And those needs do not always align with the well-being of the person being shown. Now consider the impact of that on Lorene. She becomes part of a narrative she did not create, a narrative she cannot fully control, a narrative she cannot clearly respond to. Now introduce another layer. Rumor. Because when visibility increases without clear communication, speculation follows. Accounts began to circulate. Claims about her life, her past, her relationships. Some of those claims were presented as fact, others as possibility, but many remained unverified. And that distinction is critical, because once a claim enters public discussion, it does not need confirmation to spread. It only needs attention. Now consider what that means for someone who cannot easily respond, who cannot clarify, who cannot deny, who cannot explain. Their identity becomes shaped by what others say about them, not by what they say themselves. Now consider how dangerous that can be, because misinformation does not just distort perception. It can reshape reality. It influences how people treat someone, how they think about them, how they justify their own reactions. Now extend this to the broader situation. With attention came donations. With donations came management. With management came questions. Where's the money going? Who is responsible? Who decides what happens next? And those questions introduce conflict, not just among observers, but among those directly involved. Now the story shifts again, from observation to control. Because once resources enter a situation, control follows. And control requires structure. But if structure is unclear, control becomes contested. Now consider how that affects the original subject, the family, and specifically Lorene. Because while these dynamics unfold, money, management, conflict, her ability to participate in those decisions remains limited. Now add another layer, intervention. At some point, outside systems begin to engage. Authorities, services, institutions. And when that happens, the structure of the situation changes again. Because institutional involvement introduces rules, processes, decisions made within frameworks that prioritize certain outcomes. Safety, compliance, order. Now ask another careful question. When intervention occurs, who defines what is best? Is it the system? Is it the individuals involved? Is it the family? And how much weight does each perspective carry? Now consider Lorene within that shift. A person already limited in communication, now placed inside a system that operates through formal processes, documentation, assessment, decision-making structures that require clarity. And if clarity is limited, decisions are made based on interpretation. Again, now step back, because this is the pattern repeating. Interpretation at every level, within the home, within the public, within the system, each layer adding its own version of understanding, but none of them fully accessing the internal experience of the person at the center. Now consider the final irony. For decades, Lorene lived without being seen. Then she was seen by millions. But even then, she was not fully heard. And that creates a question that does not have an easy answer. What does visibility actually change if it does not include voice? Now consider what remains. A story widely known, but only partially understood. A person widely seen, but still largely unrepresented in her own terms. And a narrative that continues to evolve, without direct input from its subject. Now think carefully about this. If a person becomes visible to the world, but cannot speak for themselves within that visibility, who owns their story? Comment one word. Public if you believe the audience shapes it. Others if you believe those around them define it. Or lost if you believe the true story remains out of reach. Because the answer to that question determines how this story should be remembered. At the end of a story like this, there is a temptation to arrive at a conclusion, to define what it all meant, to decide what should have happened, to assign responsibility in a clean, final way. But some lives resist that kind of ending, not because they lack meaning, but because the meaning is not contained in a single moment. It is spread across years, across conditions, across limitations that never fully resolved. And that is where Lorene Whittaker's story remains. Not unfinished, but uncontained. Because what makes it difficult is not what we know. It is what we cannot access. We do not have a voice in the way we expect. No recorded explanation of her thoughts. No structured account of her experience. No direct confirmation of how she understood the world around her. And that absence must be respected, not filled. Not replaced, not rewritten with imagined clarity, because to do that would repeat the same pattern that shaped her life. Others speaking where she could not, others defining what she meant, others deciding what her experience must have been. So instead of closing the story with certainty, it has to be approached differently, through limits, through restraint, through recognition of what can and cannot be known. Now consider what can be known. A life shaped by restriction, limited communication, high dependence, an environment that reduced control, a person who appears to have understood more than she could express, a person who lived within systems, family, environment, later public attention, that interpreted her more often than they listened to her. That structure is clear, even without direct testimony. Now consider what that structure reveals. Not just about one individual, but about something larger. Because Lorene's life reflects a broader reality that exists beyond this single case. A reality where people with limited communication are often defined externally, where their needs are filtered, their intentions simplified, their identities shaped by observation rather than participation, and where systems, both informal and institutional, struggle to fully include them. Now consider the moment when visibility arrived, when the world finally saw what had been hidden. That moment is often framed as discovery, but discovery is not neutral. It changes the conditions of what it touches. And in this case, it introduced attention without fully resolving the underlying limitations. So the question becomes more precise. What did visibility actually do? It increased awareness. It brought resources. It created discussion. But it also introduced pressure, expectation, interpretation on a scale that had never existed before. And for someone like Lorene, whose ability to engage with that attention was limited, those changes were not balanced. Now consider the final image that remains. Not the viral moments, not the discussions, but something quieter. A person existing at the edge of language for an entire lifetime, hearing the world, reacting to it, existing within it, but never fully able to shape how the world understood her in return. That is not a simple tragedy. It is a complex condition, one that cannot be reduced to a single explanation. Now step back one last time, because this story does not ask for a conclusion. It asks for a shift in how silence is interpreted, a shift in how visibility is valued, a shift in how stories are told about people who cannot tell them in the expected way, and most importantly, a shift in restraint. Because not every gap should be filled. Not every silence should be explained. Some should be acknowledged as limits. Now consider this carefully. If a person's inner life cannot be fully expressed and cannot be fully accessed by others, what is the most honest way to represent them? Not by completing the story, but by recognizing where it cannot be completed and stopping there. Before you leave this, answer one final question. Not about what happened, but about how it is remembered. Comment one word. Respect if you believe the story should remain within its limits. Explain if you think it should be interpreted further. Or listen if you think the focus should shift toward how silence itself is understood. Because in the end, the way this story is handled says as much about the audience as it does about the life at its center. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.